everyone. Welcome back to our journey through the book of Acts. I'm Reverend Tripp. I most often get to serve over in Cox Chapel in the sanctuary, but I'm really grateful that the Bible Reading Plan folks have asked me to come join them and join you in this journey through the earliest days of the church. We are picking up our story today in chapter 27. We started there yesterday. We'll pick up at verse 27 and go through the end of the story. Now we pick up a plot or a narrative here today where Paul and his companions on their way to Rome are just met by adversity after adversity after adversity. I don't know if you've ever been sailing like Paul is doing here, but you really count on nature to cooperate with you so you can get where you're trying to go. And Paul and his companions just were not experiencing that. In the first half, we kept seeing it was this storm, and then those waves, and then this wind, and then that wind, and they just keep being met with trial. Now we know that where Paul is going and what he's up to is this hugely important goal. It is what would be, for him, the crowning achievement of his ministerial career. He wants to get to Rome so that he can defend this new Christian faith in the heart of his known world. He wants to get to Rome, and he's been trying to get to Rome for a while. He's almost there, but he's so close and yet so far away. And so, I'm sure we can understand where he's coming from and the frustration he might feel, or our author who's taking down all this story might feel as they're just asking themselves, what do we have to do? We're so close, but we're so far away. Maybe we can understand as we think about what would be the crowning jewel of our vocational careers. Maybe you want to teach the more advanced classes, or you want to make a big sale or take your company public, and you're so close, but so far away. So what is it that you're going to do in the face of that adversity? And if you've been following us all the way through, or if you've spent much time in the book of Acts, you know that this is not new. I mean, here we are in chapter 27, and the challenges keep on coming. But we'll see Paul take a little bit of a different approach in today's passage. I believe it was in Elizabeth's video last week that she talked about how whenever Paul gets in trouble, he just starts talking. Now, for you and me, maybe starting to talk is what gets us into trouble, but nevertheless, that is how Paul defends himself, or what he does when he's faced with a crisis. He opens his mouth and begins to defend his faith, also his Roman citizenship or his Jewish upbringing, and most of the time, in some way, it gets him out of trouble. But today, he's going to do something different. So, apologies for the long setup, but we pick up the story here in verse 27, and our writer records for us that it had now been 14 days that the ship's crew had been starving themselves, and with the prisoners and everybody who was on the boat had all been starving themselves out of fear. They've tried seemingly everything. We read in yesterday's passage that the professionals had been telling the centurion who's keeping watch over the prisoners. The professionals kept telling him, we don't know what to do. We're all going to die. We're hopeless. Paul got this vision in yesterday's passage. No one's life will be lost. Only the ship will be compromised. And so here we find out they've actually been starving themselves, I suppose out of fear or temptation or trial. And Paul stands up in verse 32 and starts trying to encourage them. And we think, encourage? In circumstances like this? Well, instead of talking, Paul did that yesterday when he shared the vision. Yes, he encourages a little bit, but instead of talking his way out, he acts his way out. Pretty fitting for the title of this book of the Bible, right? He acts his way out. He does something quite familiar, and he takes bread, he gives thanks to God, he breaks the bread, and he gives it to those who are around him. Does this sound familiar? Maybe like something that Jesus did in the face of his toughest trial as he was just about to be betrayed by his close friend and go to the cross to die for all of our sin. It's what Jesus did. He took, he thanked, he broke, and he gave. It's the core practice of the Christian hope. Paul didn't speak his way out, he acted his way out. Now, pretty closely tied up with this is this little liturgical thing. Liturgical is a word for all those words we use in church, oftentimes responsively. We use it every time we celebrate Holy Communion. And it reminds us of how simple the hope was for Paul and his companions. Remember, we've talked a lot in these series already about how we didn't have long creeds yet. We didn't have theological treatises yet. There was no seminary and nobody was called reverend yet. But what we did have was a pretty simple hope that we can trace back to Paul, many of his companions, and plenty of people who came after him. It was this core threefold hope. Christ, the Messiah, died for our sins, was raised from the dead, and he will come again. And this is why when we celebrate Holy Communion together, all the people are invited to join in that acclamation. We all say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. It doesn't need to get any more complicated than that. It was called the apostolic tradition, and we see it even in his letter to the Corinthians, the first one, chapter 15. He says, "Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, that I handed on to you what was first handed on to me. Christ died for our sins, was raised on the third day, and he will come again." It's the core hope. And when we take bread, give thanks for it, break it, and give it to our friends, when we gather around the table, reminding ourselves of the hope of Jesus Christ, we find a way through the toughest of circumstances. We don't have to talk our way out, even though that works for Paul. We get to act our way out, and we embody the hope. And it's this kind of thing that must be in Paul's mind. When he writes his letter to the Thessalonians, the first one, he says, "Give thanks in all circumstances." Give thanks in all circumstances. I think this story is particularly dear to me as somebody who's called to celebrate Holy Communion, what we call a sacrament. It's why I love to do it as often as I can. And it's why I find myself, even in the toughest times, starting prayers with, "Dear God, we are just so thankful for." Sometimes it doesn't even really make sense to be so thankful, but I'd like to think that's the instinct that Paul wants to train us to become acquainted with. So friends, in the face of whatever trials you are finding, and especially as we approach this Thanksgiving holiday, and as you are being mindful of what it is you're grateful for, I invite you to consider with God, how is it that giving thanks can be a saving instinct for you? Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. God bless you.